Okay, welcome back everyone to Traumatology. I am joined by Dr. Miller. Hello, Dr. Miller.
Hello, Rebecca.
And today we'll be talking about trauma across the lifespan, which is one of your areas of expertise, especially within the university sphere.
Yes. Yeah, trauma across a lifespan. It's really important to know that when you are working with someone that there's a history. And so developmental trauma invites us in to looking at the history and where impact may have first occurred, so that you can begin to understand how impact has shaped out the development of that person across the lifespan. And so it's really important. This topic is quite large, but it really starts with getting to know the person you're working with, or even yourself. If you're experiencing something in your own life and you're thinking, why does this pattern keep coming up in my relationships, is to honor that you've come through some sort of story, right? Your lived experience story, and to go back into what do you understand about the home environment you grew up in, or the location, like the community you grew up in, or was there any sort of natural disaster that occurred when you were 2 or 3 or somewhere in your life, or even in your parents' lives, because that's where some of that intergenerational, transgenerational trauma, you're looking at the developmental trauma model, that you go back into their story and how they were impacted, and then how that would impact how they parented you as a child, and what were some of those experiences where you may have been impacted by, let's say, their lack of being able to be in some of your emotional experiences because they didn't get that in their own life. So this topic within itself, is many courses in university, plus all sorts of literature and writings and people that have been experts in this field doing research, but also practitioners that have done a lot of work around developmental trauma.
So developmental trauma is really pointing to what happened to you at the different stages of development and what was that impact, and even further than that, what happened to maybe your caregivers and their history, and going back generations to see, is there a further impact intergenerationally as well?
And to really encourage that, because sometimes when people come in for some work that seems to have more layers to it, I call, really paying attention to, okay, what do we really know about this person in relation to how they grew up and the environment that they were nurtured in or not nurtured in, right? And some of those, it could be one-ofs, but it could be many-ofs that have happened to that person in relation to something that they weren't safe in. Something that, put them in a situation where they were in significant stress response. For one-ofs or many-ofs, we don't know. And then how does that all compound and add in, other experiences when they get to school and there's a lot of bullying? And or maybe in junior high, they traumatically lose a parent. And how does that all begin to shape out who they become in the world and how they respond to the world?
The developmental stage and what's going on around them in their external world and internal world are super big key pieces to consider.
Yes, yeah, and those two sit side by side. And in order to really understand the internal world, you also need to understand what happened in the external world.
And vice versa as well.
Yes,
the
and vice
interactions
versa.
between.
Yes.
So when we talk about understanding a traumatic experience and how it impacts individuals at different stages of their development, what is it that you're considering about the developmental stage in conjunction with the traumatic event?
Well, it depends, on the person, but technically, if you go back to when they were an infant, you're considering how their parent and or parents were coping, or caregivers were coping, and whether they stayed with their caregivers or not, and why. So there's a lot of complexities. It's really like a micro interviewing, that sense of really understanding them in all these different relational dynamics that would significantly shape them out before they might even be able to articulate what was happening to them. And that's where developmental trauma invites you into, their development across the lifespan. And what do we know about, their prenatal environment even, then once they're born into the family and how the family was coping, what was happening around the family to support them or not. And then that just continues to go forward.
So if we're starting in infancy and childhood, attachment is a very key piece of the developmental trauma for early life. And we also talk about the importance in this research. They talk about the importance of responsive care for infants in childhood when these are very formative years for them. And when they have a need, they often will reach for the attention of a caregiver. But when there's neglect or trauma happening, there is no responsive care. So there is no response to their needs. And so when that happens over time, there can be very long-standing impacts of that. Can you speak to kind of what the implications of non-responsive care in a either traumatic or neglectful environment for a child might be?
And again, this is a big topic, and there's a lot of good literature, a lot of great courses, and a lot of great practitioners that have worked in and around this area that have done a lot of writing. But the basics of this is if a child is looking to have their caregiver respond to them while they're in some sort of distress or some sort of need, and a caregiver is not able to attach to them for whatever reason, there is an emotional abandonment for that child. There's no co-regulation happening, and children need adults or people that can come in and help them co-regulate, learn to soothe, right? Soothe through the stress response of whatever is happening. Could be hunger, could be something just uncomfortable, could be something, in the body that they're just trying to work through just from a regulation process. When a child is not given some sort of support to co-regulate, they're in the stress response of whatever the original experience was, but there's a further impact around stress response. They're abandoned. So then they have to work themselves through something that might be very overwhelming. The body is in some kind of acute stress. Babies cry, or eventually a baby will stop crying and go into some sort of frozen response, which means that all of that stress, all that cortisol, all that kind of activation into things aren't okay, just it's stored in the body. Really failure to thrive is some of that, where a child, even if they have food and shelter, but if they're not picked up, if they're not, attended to, if they're not kind of given that emotional nurturing, they failure to thrive as they can die. And we've seen that around some of the research that comes through some of the orphanages that might be just trying to do the best they can do, but they don't have the capacity to provide that emotional response that a child needs to know they're valued, validated, and they can co-regulate with that caregiver.
Yeah, and the role of co-regulation is really important. Like you point out, children and infants don't have the capacity to regulate their own emotions. So they really learn from what's modeled to them, and being kind of in an embrace with a caregiver, they're able to learn with rhythm and with balance to regulate those emotions. And when they don't have that, that's when they have to find these mechanisms to self-regulate. So a lot of the time, like you mentioned, children in orphanages, a strategy they use for self-soothing is a lot of rocking back and forth. So it's almost like they never had someone to rock them. So that's kind of a coping mechanism and almost a survival mechanism that they integrate in themselves.
Because the rocking is similar to the womb experience, and that helps calm the parasympathetic system, which is the opposite of the sympathetic. The sympathetic is where cortisol is kicking in and everything's accelerating into that fight, flight, freeze, like this isn't good, I gotta somehow survive it. Parasympathetic, I say, is like the parachute, kind of drops it down, right, brings it into a better, safer response. And rocking is one of those mechanisms to self-soothe, like you would have in the womb, right? And there's a rocking motion that goes on.
So these responses of not co-regulating, so this can be as simple as a parent, a baby crying and a parent being too distracted or something else going on in their world to tend to that child and give them the responsive care they need. But there's also more kind of an extreme version of that, which is this concept of adverse childhood experiences that's in the research a lot. So adverse childhood events. Can you speak to what these would look like and what the impact of these are?
Well, a lot of the adverse childhood experiences, if you take them into more of the extreme traumatic experiences, right, you're looking at all the core child abuse impact and abuse. So that's everything from your physical to your neglect to your emotional abuse, sexual abuse, And any of those psychological and emotional responses that are very destructive to children, the yelling and the intense aggression and rage that can go into a child's world. You're also looking at some of the unhealthiness of parents. So if the environment is a parent has not taken care of their own mental health, or there are addiction concerns. Also, if a parent has been involved in some sort of criminal activity, and you're looking at also if a family goes through quite a high conflict separation, divorce, and so there's lots of kind of emotional rupturing in a family system. And a child, again, is exposed to things where they're not safe, and that witnessing of it is also part of that. So those types of impacts then start to set up a child's ability to cope and to respond to their own world where they're more under stress. They may be adapting in ways that are not as healthy for who they are because they don't know any other way to regulate. And then later on in life, there's risk around physical impact. So certain physical conditions, i.e. even higher rates of diabetes, heart conditions. And then also within that, we see lower education, employment, that we don't get employed as well. And that's because when a brain and body grow and develop out of that type of stress, like where they're in a chronic state of stress response, it doesn't get to flourish, where you just sort of hold open that ability to see the world, to touch the world, to know the world, and to be very fluid in that. It's like you're responding to the world in the state of, am I going to be safe? And it leaves less capacity for brain development, where you can just be in the world to know it and to understand it.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on one of the big implications of ACEs, adverse childhood events, or experiences, is this, that our kids and infants are sponges. So what they're seeing is being modeled, and that's how they learn. They learn from that experience. So that becomes really ingrained in the psyche of a child and of an infant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very deep. Like, remember, children don't have language for everything they're going through, but the body will find a way to create its own language called behaviors, right? Because the body will respond, it will take whatever it's experienced, the brain and body, and if there isn't language formation, then it's going to do some sort of behavioral formation. And that's what it's bringing into the world, because that's the only thing it knows. It doesn't know how to put language to what some of those experiences are, and it may not remember fully what all of those experiences are in a way that I could articulate it into a story, but the body remembers it. Mm-hmm. And then it puts it into some sort of behavioral response or compulsion, right, or an impulse.
Mm-hmm. So moving in, keeping those things in mind, if we're moving into the stage of adolescence and young adulthood, how might some of these behaviors show up in individuals with that developmental trauma, especially not knowing, maybe not being aware, not having that language to tell their stories, but their bodies know?
Right. Well, we say our adolescents are some of our coolest characters in town because they're pushing the parameters, right? They understand a lot of, the world and what doesn't feel fair and just, etc. But they don't always know how to formulate it into like a story or a narrative where they can sit down and talk about it. So a lot of times they're pushing back in how they push back in boundaries. Or they might want to use their voice, but they might use it in the wrong way and use some funky language that maybe isn't respectful, and it's like a compulsive something that just needs to be said. You will see some of that impulsivity where they go into things that maybe are a little bit risky. Maybe they're wanting to take control of someone else or be involved in a group with a group of people that want to take control of other people, like gangs. That might say, we're tougher than everyone else. Let us just use our power together to let everyone know that we get to, tell people what to do or take things, et cetera, et cetera. Some of that formulation is they're trying to create an identity. They're trying to be connected to people that might be similar. And they're trying to figure out how to use power. And maybe if power has been misused against them, now they're going to misuse power against others. Right? And so that's that developmental trauma now coming into, well, I'm going to use, my own power in a way that I get to take control of others because people did that to me. Mm. And so through sort of an impulsive and compulsive type behavior, they're out there maybe hurting people or threatening people, but it doesn't mean they're a bad person, but that behavior can get quite bad. But we have to look at the story. You start to look at some of those stories underneath, and you can see a pattern of maybe in the family system that there was some, parents or people in the family system were involved in crime, or maybe there was some sort of control mechanism in relationships where people didn't get treated well. So now they bring that into their adolescent years.
And I think another really big theme around adolescent years and young adulthood is exploration and really finding yourself and your identity. A big piece of that is exploring relationships, new friendships, being exposed to new social circles, romantic relationships. And if there's some developmental trauma that has really impacted an individual's attachment and their ability to trust others, themselves, in the world, that I imagine that could have some serious implications for that area as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our adolescents go through something we call individuation. It's the process of leaving that family system and then creating a sense of self with their peers and society, right? And yet if the family system itself was not safe, the attachment wasn't strong, so they're leaving with a sense of possibly not knowing themselves in a really positive, validating way. So then they're going to go out into the peer world and do some peer-to-peer connection. But it's hard to bring in good relationships, or hard to know even how to establish good relationships if you've never really had them in your earlier years and your validation of self wasn't positive. It's like you've got a self that's really struggling, trying to figure out who are you and how do I bring in good people and how do I develop good relationships, and then how do I take that out into society as well? Because how do I know how to enter into society and to feel my worth and to know I'm negotiating that now with various systems and workplace and education and all of the things that I'm hoping to do in the world. Mm-hmm. Even like some of the sports and activities, how do I know I have a right to be respected in those type of experiences?
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly it, is the not knowing. Mm-hmm. If it's not modeled, they can't know. Mm-hmm. What about in terms of kind of academic and career outcomes in young adulthood and adolescence? Because I think another major theme is also the evolution of academics from high school into sometimes university, and then kind of establishing a career, and you're in the process of individuation into the world and establishing a professional identity as well. How might that be impacted by the developmental trauma?
Right. Well, and the research is quite clear on this one. If you have had enough adverse childhood experiences, you may not go on to graduate. You may not go on to any sort of post-secondary education or even work that matters to you. It's not because you didn't have the capacity to. It's not about intelligence. It's about the impact and all of the hardship, of working through some of those initial traumatic experiences that don't get addressed properly. Then you may not build in strong peers and strong experiences in your youth years, and then you go into your early adult years and really not knowing yourself in a safe, healthy way. And so you may not know how to choose, some of those experiences that would allow you to get some sort of education and go into work that's meaningful. Or even in high school years, you'll see a lot of kind of turmoil occur for teens as they're trying to navigate through what's happened to them, and as they enter into their relationships, and maybe they didn't get a chance to have good peer relationships, and then it starts to impact their self-esteem and their self-concept, like, who am I? What is my worth in the world? And then if you don't know your worth in the world, it's hard to set up other experiences that let you experience that in a good way. And that then can compound into not being employed in ways that are meaningful. And if you think of all that development, and take your early 20s, and a lot of the research is saying that the brain is not fully developed until somewhere in your mid-20s, and even that number's moving around now. That seems to be pushed back more. Those ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, they're saying they end at 18, but really that would carry into your 20s because your brain is still developing. So if I have traumatic impact in some of my peer-to-peer relationships, or I'm harassed in the workplace, then that's going to further compound any earlier on developmental trauma. So that developmental trauma should be extended into those mid-20s, that our young adults are very susceptible to be further impacted. And then that takes away from their vitality and capacity to educate, to go into work that's meaningful, which then further takes away from what they could experience in society as they continue to grow forward.
And when we talk about growing forward, so extending that impact, they have, like you mentioned, a higher propensity to have compounded negative experiences. If they've faced these ACEs early in life, they might be at higher risk to experience or to have greater impact by negative experiences throughout their life.
Yes.
So when we're talking about this impact carried through into for older adults and sometimes our senior citizens, what are some of those patterns that we're seeing with this population?
Well, anything unresolved earlier in life is going to further impact you later in life, right? So if you didn't get a chance to work through some sort of traumatic impact, let's say within interpersonal relationships in your childhood, and then there was bullying in your youthhood and then early adulthood, maybe you picked a partner together, you found each other and you weren't, as healthy as could be, but you stayed together, but then there's further impact, and then you don't get to do work that matters to you, and you don't maybe parent in the way that was meaningful. All of that carries into your later in life experience and impacts how you feel about yourself and maybe the way you respond to the world. So you didn't get to go and learn something that mattered. You didn't get to go and find something that was meaningful and helped you develop your self-esteem. And so then as you're less able later in life, you're also, again, susceptible to being preyed on because you may not know what a healthy relationship is. And also your capacity changes, and so it becomes sometimes harder to navigate through some of the boundaries. And, we hear stories and we know in the research that, our aging population is very susceptible to financial abuse because within the relationship of, their finances and people that might show up in their life, people show up to prey on them. And if you haven't navigated relationships where you know your worth and your own kind of individual personal power, you might be susceptible. And those that want to pray know that. So there's this whole unfolding that what you didn't know around how to kind of reclaim your power, find worth and meaning in your relationships in your life, that will compound everything else that comes into your life later in life that you need to navigate around power and control dynamics. And then it compounds mental health and physical health.
Right. It's very multidimensional. Just hearing you speak about it reminds me of the socio-ecological model. So if there's this developmental trauma, it impacts the individual. So the individuation process, what they do for themselves, what they do in their work. Also within their family systems, it affects if there's a weak attachment or a dysfunctional attachment, how will that affect their ability to be in a partnership with someone and be a parent to their children? And then within the community, what are they, how are they showing up in their world and beyond that? And like you mentioned, extended into our senior citizens as well, like the ability or kind of their propensity to be preyed on as well. And that attachment piece kind of shows up there as well.
And we know, as people age, they may be more isolated due to different abilities, right? The body changes, there could be health complications. So they're also going through maybe a loss of ability, which leaves them more isolated. And if there are psychological, hurts and wounds, things that they haven't been able to sort out, that gets also buried, internalized, and then they have less social support because they're not able to access in the same way.
Right. And I think for that population as well, for the senior population, there's a lot of more intergenerational work because it's not until recently that there's been outlets and resources readily available to work through a lot of that and opportunity to. So I imagine there's a lot of compounding there as well.
Yes. And as they go into, sort of the last phases of life, it really is their legacy. There's so much wisdom in the legacy of those that are aging, and it doesn't get properly accessed when there's been, developmental trauma that hasn't been addressed properly because they may be less able to bring themselves back into the world, or they don't know how to establish those relationships. And also society sometimes doesn't deem them as worthy because they're not as functioning in the same way. But yet then we miss out on the wisdom of our elders.
And I think just going back to adults as well, I think the parenting piece is really huge because we talked about what's modeled to you. And a lot of the times, what we carry on into late adulthood is what was modeled to us as well. So there's an intergenerational piece of just parenting modeling that comes with that. And if those are the tools that have brought you to be the individual you are, then oftentimes those are the same tools and approaches you'll use with your children.
Yes. And I think in relation to the developmental trauma, that's why it's so important to have the prevention is your intervention. And yet if we don't get to the prevention is your intervention, then the early intervention. Because if someone didn't learn how to parent in a way that would be healthy and they can attach and they can get the supports in the community to help them, early intervention means we need to get into a child's life sooner so that we can provide the child with a new model, with new resources. And if you think of some of the neurodevelopmental work that's being done, the whole idea is to go back in the bottom-up approach is to help the child learn to regulate their own emotional well-being and then teach them out things. Because when a parent isn't able to give the emotional attachment in a safe way, child's body goes into stress response. If their body goes into stress response, then it becomes behavioral responses. So a lot of the research and some of the new work is help a child go back into their body to regulate internally as we teach them how to sit, next to their little friend and not go over and, take things from them. Sometimes our environments come in from the top down. Okay, sit still. Don't do that. And they don't actually have the internal regulation capacity because they didn't learn that from their primary parent. Right? So there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle. And so early intervention says if we realize in the classroom that a child is not able to sit and, be respectful and interact with their peers, okay, how do we go back in from the bottom-up model? How do we go back into the parents' world and see where maybe their developmental trauma isn't addressed? And then all of that, of course, plays forward. And even if the parent then turns into a grandparent and they still haven't learned some of the, regulation, they haven't learned the strategies, they haven't understood why they're not able to be with their adult children in a way that's healthy and well, they can still learn, but we have to go in and with some more, support and interventions to help them so that they can continue to be around their adult children and their grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Within the family work that you do, the early intervention for the children themselves is super key. And then an extension to that would be work with the parents, helping them, like you mentioned, helping them to identify any potential developmental trauma maybe they have and work through that process. Or just to have a conversation around validating that what is modeled to them, they can't know what maybe is ideal for their child's development if maybe it wasn't modeled. So really a process that's not shaming and validating is very important for the parent to work as well.
If you look at some of the Indigenous teachings and some of the work that's being done around the spider web, and that's a piece of work that's been done here through the Faculty of Child Studies and Social Work, with the Indigenous community bringing in the teachings, and Roy Bearchief has been bringing in the wisdom around the spider web model where the child is in the middle of the web and then the whole of the community supports the child. And the elders play a very important role in bringing in the wisdom and the support and the relational dynamics of being there, right, as the teachers and the givers of wisdom. I think that model shows us so much the importance, right, of the interconnectivity of those relationships for the well-being of the child and the community as a whole. And so those teachings that have been gifted back over to the faculty and then out into the students are really important for all practitioners. If you think about that model, that it takes a community to raise a child, but it also, takes a community to help a community heal, and that all parts of that community are very important. And so when you go back into developmental trauma, you need to help the whole of that family to heal, and it needs the community to do that. And the child needs all of that in order to be healthy.
That really goes back to a very basic human need of just connection. It really ties it back to looking at the family system, looking back into the history of the family as well to identify, is there developmental trauma and what can we do to go forward? And I think to end, just really emphasizing that we learn from our experience and what's modeled from us. And that can really become ingrained and encoded in an individual. However, to remember also that our brains are plastic and we can relearn and we can override any negative patterns or dysfunctional patterns and behaviors into more adaptive and healthy ways so that we can start to pass those down to generations and kind of break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. In Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book, again, I'm bringing it up again, What Happened to You, they mentioned the quote. Dr. Bruce Perry says, "With love, the unloved can become loving." So that's really pointing to the cycle can break, and with education and proper support and people who care, that can begin to happen.
Yes, and I think that's such a powerful quote, and to think about love as an action, right? It is to be involved, it is to engage, right, in the relationship, it is to respond, it is to find ways to support those that haven't been supported. So the actioning of love becomes most important when you're trying to help people to heal and to know they always mattered. The person that was in their world that couldn't show them that, someone else can come in and bring them, bring that back to them.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Any
Thank you.
final thoughts, Dr. Miller?
I'm looking forward to our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks.